Their architecture firm never closed, not when they bought the boat, not when they crossed the Atlantic, not when they reached the Arctic. For 10 years, while hundreds of thousands of people watched them live the life they claimed to have walked away from, that company was still sitting there, quietly active, registered and real. The couple behind Sailing Uma, Dan Deckard and Kika Mevs, built one of the most followed sailing channels on YouTube on the back of a single idea, that they had given everything up. But the full story is more complicated, more interesting, and far more honest than that version suggests. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what they gave up, what they kept, and why the thing they held on to might be the reason the whole journey actually worked. They came from opposite ends of the world, not just geographically. Almost everything about their childhoods pointed in different directions. Dan Deckard grew up in a small, rural community in British Columbia, Canada. Not a suburb, not a small town, a log cabin. His father taught him navigational skills, instilled something in him about confidence in the outdoors, about comfort with things that were unfamiliar and physically demanding. He had no connection to sailing. He had no background in boats. What he had was a sense that the world was bigger than what was directly in front of him, and a tolerance for figuring things out without a manual. Kika Mevs grew up in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Her mother worked at the commercial port. As a child, Kika would watch container ships from her brother's bedroom window and close her eyes, picturing herself on one of them, going somewhere she had never been. She was, by her own admission, a dreamer. At 18, she left Haiti to study architecture in the United States. Then, in 2010, Haiti was hit by a catastrophic earthquake while she was at school in Atlanta. She felt helpless in a way that changed something permanently. She said later that the experience taught her how fragile life was and how vast the world felt in that moment. She knew she couldn't spend it at a desk. They met at Southern Polytechnic State University in Atlanta, both studying architecture. Neither of them sailed. It was never a topic. What they shared was the conviction that real experience, not textbooks, not someone else's blueprints, was the point of the whole thing. They graduated, they started a business together, an architecture and design consulting firm called Dead M Studios. They were doing renovation work. They had an apartment, a car each, all the markers of a functional adult life in a mid-sized American city. And that's when a stranger at a friend's apartment changed the direction of everything. They were helping a friend move into a new place in Atlanta in 2014, carrying boxes up the stairs, sharing beers, the way you do. The friend's roommate was there, someone who traveled constantly, never stayed long, lived out of 2 suitcases. He told them, if you want to travel the world, don't buy a couch. It sounds simple, maybe even obvious. But Dan and Kika turned it over for weeks. The couch, as Kika would explain years later in a TEDx talk, was never really about furniture. It was about the weight of objects, the way people anchor themselves to things and then mistake the anchors for safety. They realized they were about to buy a couch, metaphorically, all of them at once. The apartment, the furniture, the mortgage-sized commitment to a life that was already laid out. By the end of the summer of 2014, they had sold most of what they owned. They found a 1972 Pearson 36 in Boston, in a condition that would have made most people walk away. The asking price was $21,000. The engine was seized. Dan offered $3,000 cash. They accepted. The boat became their home before the renovation was anywhere near finished. They lived aboard in a boatyard in the middle of a Boston winter while they worked on it. Neither of them had ever sailed. But here's the part that changes everything about what you just heard. When they announced to the world, through their YouTube channel, through their social media, through every interview they gave, that they had walked away from conventional life, what they meant and what was literally true were 2 different things. Dead M Studios, the architecture firm they had founded together right out of college, did not close. According to multiple sources that have tracked the channel's business history, the company remained active, registered, real. Years into the sailing life, it was still there. This is not a scandal. It's actually one of the most interesting things about them, and it's a detail that almost no coverage of Sailing Uma has ever paused on. Think about what that means in practice. They were at sea, on a 36-foot electric sailboat, crossing oceans, surviving a Category 4 hurricane at anchor in Haiti, sailing to within a few hundred miles of the North Pole, and simultaneously, on paper at least, they were still architects. 2 identities, 2 versions of themselves. One that the world was watching. One that just never completely stopped existing. Kika has framed this in terms of architecture as a philosophy, not just a job. They didn't see sailing and designing as opposites. They saw them as expressions of the same underlying drive, to understand how people live, how structures work, how environments shape behavior. The boat was a design problem. Every upgrade was an engineering problem. The electric motor conversion was both. And that motor is where this story gets particularly interesting. When the original diesel engine on Uma turned out to be a total write-off, after they wasted $3,000 on a replacement engine that also didn't work, Dan and Kika were sitting in Haiti working on an architectural project and looking for a better answer. They landed on electric propulsion. In 2015, this was not a mainstream idea for a cruising sailboat. There was no established playbook. There was no community of people doing it at this scale. What there was, for Dan, was a background in construction, a willingness to try things before he understood them fully, and a used forklift motor. He built the first electric drive system for Uma himself. The motor cost approximately $1,400. It was not designed for saltwater. It was not designed for an ocean passage. He mounted it, wired it, and they sailed it through the Caribbean, up the east coast of the United States, across the North Atlantic. It overheated before the batteries ran out. They couldn't regenerate charge under sail. The system had real limitations. They sailed around them. They learned in the water, not in a classroom. Dan's background in construction, the years he spent running a small renovation company before university, turned out to be the thing that made the difference between a boat that worked and one that didn't. His hands already knew how to figure things out from first principles. The architecture degree gave him the structural thinking. The forklift motor gave them an ocean crossing. What happened next is the reason this story spread across the internet. Most sailing channels go south, into warm water, trade winds, postcard anchorages. That's the circuit. The Caribbean, the Pacific, the Mediterranean if they're feeling ambitious. Dan and Kika went north. In 2021, they pointed Uma towards Svalbard, the Norwegian archipelago at 80 degrees north latitude. As far north as a sailing vessel can reasonably go on this planet. There are no roads. There are polar bears. There is, for part of the year, no sun at all. They documented the entire passage. The energy management on an all-electric boat in northern latitudes, where solar generation drops dramatically, was a significant problem that they worked through in real time. The footage captured conditions that most sailing channels never attempt, and their audience, by this point in the hundreds of thousands, watched all of it. Svalbard changed the perception of what sailing Uma actually was. This wasn't a lifestyle channel. This wasn't comfort tourism on a nice boat. This was a test program for what an all-electric sailboat could actually do when pushed to the edge of what was reasonable. By the time they sailed back south and eventually crossed into the Mediterranean, Uma was no longer the $3,000 basket case from a Boston boatyard. She was a fully converted, solar-powered, purpose-built expedition vessel, and she was approaching the end of what she could reasonably handle without major intervention. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. By 2023, it was clear that Uma had reached a structural limit. A 50-year-old fiberglass hull pushed through 28,000 nautical miles across more than 28 countries, through a Category 4 hurricane, through Arctic waters. The boat was showing its age at a fundamental level, not cosmetically, structurally. Dan and Kika moved to Sardinia, Italy, and began what they're calling Step 3.0, the most significant rebuild Uma has ever undergone. This isn't a refit. They stripped the deck. They reinforced the hull-to-deck joint with modern composites. They cut the mast in half and had a custom replacement built by John Mast. They're installing not one but two commercial-grade Ocean-Volt servo-prop electric sail drives, a configuration that has almost never been done on a monohull of this size. Everything on the boat will run on electricity. The wood stove is gone. The alcohol stove is gone. The dinghy's petrol motor is gone. Every system, from cooking to propulsion to communication, feeds from the same electrical grid. As of mid-2026, they remain in Sardinia, working through the final stages. They've teased what they're calling their biggest adventure yet, without specifying the destination. Their audience, which now sits above 430,000 subscribers, is watching and waiting. In a development that tells you exactly how far this channel has traveled from a parking lot in Boston, Uma's interior has now been digitally recreated and made available in the Marineverse VR sailing simulator. She is the first dedicated cruising yacht in the platform. You can now sail their boat in virtual reality before they've even finished rebuilding the real one. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. There's a version of the sailing Uma story that's easy to tell. Two young architects see through the lie of conventional life, walk away from everything, and sail off into a beautiful, untethered existence. The internet loves that story. It's clean. It sells. The real version is messier and more useful. They didn't erase their professional identities. They carried them onto the boat. Day Studios didn't disappear because architecture didn't disappear. It just changed form. The same skills that would have been used to design buildings in Atlanta were redirected into designing a livable, functioning, ocean-crossing home inside 36 feet of 1970s fiberglass. The structural thinking, the materials knowledge, the ability to look at a broken thing and visualize what it could become, that transferred entirely. Dan's construction background meant he could wire an electric motor from a forklift into a sailboat and make it work across an ocean passage. Kika's design sensibility shaped how Uma felt to live in, the removal of visual barriers to make a small space feel open, the deliberate choices about what stayed and what went. They were never really two people living one life and pretending to live another. They were two people who refused to accept that the thing they had built, their skills, their thinking, their professional identity, had to stay behind when they left the city. They took it with them, and it turned out to be the most important thing they packed. The lesson in Dan and Kika's story isn't that you should quit your job and buy a boat, though some people probably will after watching their channel. The lesson is that the skills you spend years building don't belong to the life you're trying to leave. They belong to you. Right now, they are in Sardinia, finishing the most ambitious version of Uma that has ever existed. A twin-electric, fully rebuilt, 50-year-old sailboat prepared for something they haven't named yet. Whatever comes next will be filmed, published, and watched by an audience that has followed this particular forklift motor around the world for a decade. The question for you is this: do you think Dan and Kika were right to keep Day Studios running in the background all those years? Or does that complicate the story they told their audience? Drop your answer below.